Gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the seminar series of MNS University of Agriculture, Multan. Today we have with us our guest speaker, Professor Rana Munns from Canberra, Australia. Most of you know Rana Munns. She is one of the world top ranked scientists in the field of plant stress physiology. The topic of our today's talk is scientific writing skills and publishing tips. I hope the Vice Chancellor will join shortly. We will love to have his comments later during the session. I would like to request participants that during the talk, please keep your mics mute. We will have a question answer session at the end of presentation. You can also write your questions in the chat box. Please be brief and clear. We also announced that the PowerPoint presentation and recording of today's session will be shared in GRC WhatsApp group later today. Thank you. Professor Rana Munns, please share your screen and go ahead. Floor is yours.
Right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Tanvir. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm just checking that you can hear me okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
That's good. Well, thank you. My opening slide is a photo of durum wheat growing in New South Wales. I thought you'd be interested in that. So I'll move straight into the presentation. I've structured the talk, firstly, choosing a journal, which is not always where you start writing a paper, but I have found that it is very useful to decide on the journal before you start, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then in writing the paper, I'm just focusing on the three main parts: the introduction, results, and discussion. And yes, you, Dr. Tanvir, had asked if I would spend a bit more time on the discussion, because that can be the hardest part to write, at least to decide what content should go in the discussion versus the results, or the discussion versus the introduction. And you do find yourself repeating things in those two sections, which I think is unavoidable, really. And then finally, just a few tips about publications and journals and maximising your citations. So, choosing the right journal. Who are you writing for? When you start writing, who are you writing for? You're not really just writing for yourself, because if you're writing for yourself, it's just a diary. Perhaps you're writing for your supervisor, or perhaps if you're a postdoc or beyond, you're writing for your colleagues, your respected colleagues. But then you are also writing for authors of papers that you do not know, you haven't met, but you know they work in a similar topic and you would like them to read the paper. So if you make a list of, say, about 10 authors who you hope will read your paper, and then what journals do they publish in, and you might like to choose the same journal that they publish in the hope that they will more readily, find your paper. And also it shows it's the appropriate journal as far as the content goes. So if you list your preferred journals, you could compare their impact factor, and I think it's good to aim for above 2 if you can. And note any publication charges. Now, this is becoming a bit of an issue because open access is becoming a big thing, and open access journals, that is all papers open access, are very expensive. They're about $3,000 to $4,000 US. It's possible for countries in which don't deal in US dollars readily, they will reduce charges, but you have to argue with them about it. So most of us prefer to publish in what's called the hybrid journals that have no page charges, but their papers are not freely available, at least for a couple of years. So that's a decision to make. And then, having chosen the journal, you'll get the guide or the template from the journal, and have a look at that before you even start writing. Now, a couple of tips just for the writing style. I won't really talk about style much, more just content, but tips for the writing style are it should be simple and clear and should use as fewer words as possible. And if you can say the same thing in fewer words, use the fewer words. And I think it's good if you have somebody that you respect, it could be a friend or a colleague or another author, someone you respect and you like their writing style, perhaps you can sort of get a few tips from their style and what makes you find it easy to read. Right. Now, into the paper itself. The abstract might be the only part of the paper that many people will read, for the simple reason that it may not be open access. So abstracts are always freely available, but to get to the main part of the paper can take some effort. So the abstract's got to be good, and it's got to make people want to go to the effort of getting the full paper, like writing the author or writing into ResearchGate or going to a library to see whether libraries have it. So the abstract's really important. I suggest it's done first before you start on the paper, but a lot of people like to do it last, but I try and do it first. The abstract summarises the content of the paper and it highlights the most important new finding. It should not cover everything, but it just pick out the most important new finding, the one that will attract the most interest for readers. But then behind that important new finding, you have to explain the reason for the work, briefly the experimental design, you know, like at least was it field or was it glasshouse or hydroponics or what, and the main result, of course, and then its significance. It's one thing to say, you know, we found this, but we really need to go on and say why this is so significant, and you're probably looking to the future when you think about the significance. So the introduction. Say the reader has liked your abstracts, gone to the trouble of getting the whole paper, start with an eye-catching statement and certainly avoid the words, it is clear that, or it is well known that, or whatever. It isn't very interesting to start, say, it is well known that the atmospheric CO2 concentration is rising as a result of fossil fuel use, blah, blah, because everyone knows that. And then you might follow it with a string of references. That is really not informative and it's boring. So what you could do is turn that round and make a very direct statement. Say that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased from 350 parts per million to 400 parts per million over the last 50 years, and just give a single very authoritative reference to that. Then that sort of grabs people, and then you go on to say how that's relevant to your study. So the first paragraph will summarise the relevant literature, probably not yours, but showing that you've really read the literature. And the second paragraph, then you become more specific and you bring in the literature that's really relevant to your particular study, showing why you've chosen to do this work, and there you can refer to your own, we should refer to your own papers because they are also relevant background. And then the third paragraph, you state the aim of the study. You've already given the reason for the study, but state the specific aim, the reason for choosing the cultivars or the varieties or the mutants or whatever that you're using, why you've chosen to the treatment that you've used, whether it's nutrient deficiency or toxicity. And now this is optional. You can finish with a concise description of the contribution of this paper. In other words, you say here what you're going to say at the end, but you're alerting the reader to what you're going to say. And a lot of people are doing this now. It's without actually giving everything away. Well, I mean, abstract's already given it away, but something to whet their appetite so they keep reading. So you can finish with the introduction with a sentence like, the results in this paper challenge the idea that something or other is causing something. Or you could say this paper provides an explanation of, an otherwise sort of unknown phenomena. Or you could just simply say, this paper shows that. Now, this is really quite boring in relation to the previous two, but at least, and it's just factual, but it's got to be, it's got to have something that makes people want to keep reading it. And I should say here that you should refer to your previous work and then the other major work of others that launched you on this particular paper. So now for the results. Most results are broken up into a series of headings or subheadings, 3 or 4 subheadings. Makes it much easier to read. Figures, most journals would, their guidelines or instructions to authors for figures, there's 6 to 8 figures. I should add that the legends need to be complete. I know a lot of authors don't actually give a complete legend because they'd be repetitive, they're almost the same from figure to figure, but they need to be complete because readers will look at that figure and they'll read the caption and they won't read the text. I mean, if I go to a paper, I always look at all the figures first before I even start reading the text of the results. So the figures are a summary really of where you are. So you give enough detail so that the reader knows what all the data means and what it's for. And it's very tedious for the reader to sort of trawl through the methods to find out, how old were the plants when the experiment started, things like that. And I'd suggest using colour, certainly with block colour, with histograms and so on. Use colour whenever you can. It makes it easier to read and it makes it more modern and it's free. So journals don't charge at all for colour. For the online version, most journals will charge when they print. So you'll see when the printed paper comes out, it'll be black and white. But online, the same paper online is colour, and I'd suggest use it wherever you can. And then the tables, plant biology journals will tend to have quite short tables. Their summaries, easy to read. Agricultural type journals will tend to have a lot more complex tables, a lot of, say, statistical ones. But try not to have too many columns, so you have to turn the page sideways to read it, because switching from landscape to portrait when you're ploughing through a paper is quite difficult. And when you think of to the reviewer who's got to read it first, you can't easily turn your computer on your side to read the table. So I'd suggest you do everything portrait, and the large figures go as supplementary files. And just a comment about supplementary files. When you come to submit the paper, they can get you into trouble. I've, as an editor, received papers when supplementary file was actually an Excel, not a chart, an Excel table. And when the journal's PDF maker, when they combined it with the main part of the paper, they gave every single numeral and word on that Excel file its own page, so that the manuscript had 1,200 pages. And the author apparently never bothered to check the PDF. And this has happened a few times, I've found. So or people have put in images that are too high resolution, like 10 or 20 meg, and again, a lot of people just can't receive files of that magnitude, and so reviewers get very cross when this happens. So I'd suggest when you put the manuscript together, the supplementary files, they go at the end of the main manuscript. They're all in portrait. The whole thing's in a Word document, and you check that everything is readable. So, but I like supplementary files. I use them a lot myself. I think a benefit to the author to have sort of second order data that is important, but not as important as the main data. So now when you start sort of writing around the results, the text of the results section, I don't think you sort of need to repeat everything that's in the actual figures. You don't need to say after so many days, this went up and then later it went down, and this treatment gave, more such and such than another. That should be so obvious from the figures. You really don't need to say it, and actually it detracts from it if you put a whole lot of words around something that visually is so clear. So, a picture is equal to 1,000 words. So I think let the figures speak for themselves. Tables don't speak for themselves so well. So you probably have to guide the reader through the tables. And in both figures and tables, only the most important differences need highlighting and stating in words. Now, this is a bit that's sometimes a little hard to manage. The results section can interpret the results. It doesn't just have to simply state in words what the figures and tables. It can interpret the results. I mean, obviously you analyse the data, like statistically analyse it, but you can think critically about it as well. And I think a lot of authors probably don't spend enough time in the results to actually really discuss the results properly. I think that can make it then much easier to move into the discussion if you've already discussed the statistical or the analytical or the numerical part of the results. I think then you can move more easily into the discussion, and the discussion doesn't have to repeat the results. I've seen so often as an editor, I've had papers that really the first page of the discussion is really just repeating the results and throwing in a few references like, you know, this is similar to what was found by so-and-so. So I think, yeah, and often then that makes the discussion so much longer in text than the results, whereas I feel they should be about the same. So the results, discuss the results, and then move on to the discussion, then discusses the results in relation to the literature. Now, in the discussion, you're putting your results into what is known, what has already been published in the literature, and then you can point out differences, you can point out where it might deviate from the literature, and then you can suggest why it might deviate from the literature. Now, this can also help to put into 3 to 4 subheadings. So when you start the discussion, there's just a very general comment about the set of results as a whole, and then you start diving into discussing them in relation to the literature, and then that's when you bring in all the other references. You can point out that the results were expected because of such and such, or they were unexpected, and then you've got to suggest an explanation of why they were unexpected. And then you can start talking about mechanisms, physiological mechanisms or molecular mechanisms, agronomic explanations. That's where you start to move away from your own results and relate them to other people's results. And all the time you emphasise the novelty of your own results and why they're probably better than other people's. So this leads on to the conclusion. So you could have the last paragraph of the discussion could start in conclusion, blah, blah, blah. Or if you want to expand it, you could actually have that as a subsection of the results, and then you have a couple of paragraphs there. So it's again, it's a summary of the main findings and a mechanistic explanation of them. And then most importantly, it states the general significance of the study as a whole. And you can point to future research. It could be, you might end up saying this, this indicates the need for more work in this area. I mean, you probably are going to do it yourself, but it's probably just best to leave it as saying more work in this area is needed to investigate these specific issues. And then the acknowledgements and authorships. I would always acknowledge advice from colleagues, like suggestions from colleagues, those sort of friends of mine that read early drafts of the manuscript and helped a lot. So I would always acknowledge people who'd read the manuscript and made important contributions. And I really actually encourage at least one of the colleagues to be lent upon to read through the whole manuscript. I know it's quite a lot of work, but it really does benefit. The manuscript benefits a lot by having somebody who hasn't done any of the work but does understand the importance of it to 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 read through it, and you thank them very, very much for all the time and effort they've spent on it. The technical assistants need to be thanked. I would thank people that ran the analytical services. I would thank them. Unsupervised technical assistants will often warrant an authorship. And then, of course, have to be funded by external grants, and a lot of journals insist on this. In fact, they have a list of external grantors that you've got to find their checklist and put it in. And then, of course, if colleagues have given you germplasm or let you use their own material, that needs to be acknowledged, as well as any unpublished data from others. Authorships can be controversial. So in a way, it's best to get that sorted out first. I think the first author is pretty clear. This would be the person that did most of the work. And also the person who writes the first draft of the paper. The supervisor might often write the first draft of the paper. But generally the person who did the work at least will have prepared all the figures and all the tables, and really should have made an effort to read the literature and draft out an introduction and so on. Sometimes there's many people who could be first authors, so that's a bit tricky. So perhaps it could be pre-agreed first. And then the order of authorship, if the first author is like a senior postdoc, they might suggest the order in which the authors are listed. Sometimes it's alphabetical, sometimes on the basis of the effort put into the writing process. But usually the supervisor has the final say, and usually the supervisor is the last author and the corresponding author. So that's the, I've just got two more slides. That's what I say about the writing process. Now, these are some comments from journal editors, and it's based on this paper that we published just a short while ago in Functional Plant Biology called What Makes a Plant Science Manuscript Successful for Publication. In that, we didn't write about writing style or things like that at all. We really just looked at how a journal and its editors would receive a paper, and whether they would reject it outright or whether they'd send it for review, and what would be their reasons for rejecting or accepting the paper. Now, I sent this paper to Dr. Tanvir last week, and it's open access. We paid a lot of money, like $3,000 US, to make it open access, because we thought there was no point writing this if people have to pay to, who can't readily find it. And so this is sort of a summary of what we found, that most journal editors, we surveyed about 25 journals, agricultural and physiological and molecular. And what the journal editors and associate editors, handling editors, want novelty, and they want accurate data with the right methodology and the interpretation of the data, and the interpretation should be based on the data, not some idea of what the data might have shown if in an ideal circumstance you've got to actually just interpret the data you have and not move past it and not over-interpret it, I suppose I'm saying. And the reasons for rejection from all the journal editors were a lack of sufficient novelty. I mean, just because that experiment's been done on one species doesn't mean it's of any great value to do it on a different species. A lot of editors found flaws in the methods used or flaws in data interpretation. In many of the papers they rejected, inadequate analysis of the data. A lot of complained about inadequate statistical analysis and poor critical scientific thinking. It's sort of related to the two above, that there were flaws there, flaws in the methods, odd results, but the authors hadn't really picked that up and either just sort of went on regardless. I actually didn't see that there were some things that didn't make sense. So critical scientific thinking was a very important, if not essential, part of the manuscript. And there's more information on that in the that perspective paper below. So just lastly, citations. We're all now finding that citations are really the key thing for promotions and getting jobs and so on. It's not sufficient anymore to write 4 papers a year if they're not highly cited. If they only get a couple of citations, it's assumed people don't read them, or they're not interested, or they don't have value. So you've really got to try and increase your citations, and the first thing you've got to do is get people to read the paper. So that's the important thing, not publish in an obscure journal, which is very difficult to get hold of. Now, there's 2 things you could do to help your paper to be read and cited. And one is to write an interesting title, an informative title, perhaps a catchy title, but catchy titles sometimes are not that informative. They're cute, but what do they mean? So it needs to be informative, but it also needs to not be very long and very boring and very neutral, the effects of such and such on whatever. That doesn't tell you, that's not informative at all. You've really got to say that, such and such treatment increases the, yield of wheat under particular condition. You can't just say the effect of phosphorus application on the yield of wheat. It's really got to have a lot more in the title, and then people will read it. And so journals have estimated that people spend 2 seconds on a title. So you'll be reading through a search, results of a search, or you're reading through a table of contents of a journal, and your eye scans down, and you will on average spend 2 seconds on the title before moving on, because you haven't picked a keyword. You haven't picked anything in that title that's of interest. So 2 seconds later, you've moved on. Now, find something of interest, you scan the abstract, and you might spend 20 seconds on the abstract. That's the average time people spend on scanning an abstract. They've got 10 or 20 papers in their search routine, and they scan the abstract. So the first sentence of the abstract is really important to catch the reader's attention, and then the content's got to be informative and interesting and significant. So you grab the reader, make sure that the title has keywords, if not the abstract, has them. And then to make sure the abstract is really quite appealing to people other than those that are really in the field, it's a good idea to get a friend, non-specialist, to read the abstract, to see if it has appeal, it has interest, that it might make somebody want to keep reading your paper and therefore cite your paper. Just one last comment about open access. Normally, most of us can't afford to pay full open access fees unless you get a special grant or something to do it. A lot of us use ResearchGate or LinkedIn to get hold of papers from other authors of common interest. You can just write, if you see a paper, you can just write to the corresponding author and request the PDF. But and that's when I was young, that's what you did all the time. You just wrote off and asked for a reprint. Nobody's asked me for a reprint for years, but I get a lot of requests on ResearchGate, so that seems to have taken over. And there are journals that will give you the best of both worlds. They won't charge you an open access fee, but they will make your papers free online after 1 year or 2 or 3. Now, Journal of Experimental Botany is fantastic. 12 months after your paper is published, whether it's published in January or December, is actually 12 months after that paper is published, it then becomes free online. And I know Plant Cell and Environment, even though it's a commercial journal, it used to be 3 years. 3 years after it's published, it becomes free online. And I think they've even moved to 2 years. So I personally think those sort of journals should be supported. But the landscape's changing. A lot of journals are all going open access. So this will be changing, I'd say, over the next couple of years, and I'm not sure how that is going to work out, but I think it's going to cost a lot of money. So that's, my summary. I just acknowledge one of the CSIRO leaders, Peter Hairsign, for really getting me started on this. He ran 3-day workshops on scientific paper writing when he got about 20 or 30 quite senior CSIRO people who said they never had time to write papers. He got them to give up 3 days, put an out-of-office reply on their email, and then just sit down for 3 days. And in that time, they really were able to draft a paper. And everyone said that was a very valuable exercise. So that's another tip. If you really haven't got a time, well, you just got to make it. You can't write a paper just fitting it into your spare time. You've really just got to stop doing a whole lot of things and just get stuck into it. So, Tanvi, that's, there we go. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Rana, for elaborating everything in such a beautiful way.